Hello and welcome to another episode of Tinker Time with WB7 VPC. Consider this. The following video contains shop language. If this offends you, it is best to leave now. I just require all the coffee in the world. So obviously this is, I'm doing this well after we have completed assembly of this box, or this shelf for my ham radio stuff. But I thought it might be more interesting to try doing a voiceover for this than to just put subtitles or text for what we're doing. I make no guarantee that I'm anywhere near entertaining, but we'll pretend like we are anyway, and this gives me something to do early in the morning while the dogs bark outside and I question my sanity. So what we're working on to start off with is putting the supports, basically framing the place for the middle shelf of this cabinet, of this, I am going to say shelf a lot, to sit on. So we're countersinking everything into the from the bottom, which is the face that we're looking at now, so that the screw heads aren't going to scratch into the surface of the desk. You know, if this was just straight framing, we could get a little bit more aggressive and just use the impact driver and hammer straight through and countersink them by virtue of the head of the screw. But I don't want to split this material. I don't want to blow it into a million pieces, which has a tendency to happen when you try doing stuff that way. So we countersink them and put them in by hand, at least the first go around. And that way we can make sure that, you know, we're gentle enough with it that the 2x3 isn't going to get annihilated while we're driving in these big, I think they were 2-inch or 2.5-inch wood screws. They were way bigger than they needed to be, but, you know, that's what I had on hand, and I was trying to do this relatively cheap. So since everything's sitting flush when we turn this thing upside down, like, you know, so-ish, you know, we aren't going to have any issues. And kind of ponder what we're going to do for a bus bar, because, again, I'm being cheap, and I don't want to spend any more money than I have to. I've got some leftover material from a grounding rod that'll work pretty well for what we're doing. And we're going to put the middle shelf into this operation. You can see where we're going here. Just make sure that everything's square, because we've got 4 weeble wobble pieces standing up in the air. I know that the shelves themselves are cut relatively square, so as long as we match everything up on end, the box should be square, at least within acceptable squareness throughout the process. Now, eventually we're going to have a little bit of a trick to figure out, and it took a bit of pondering. Basically a build around a problem, or build to solve a problem. So, you know, if we're just doing 2 shelves, what we're doing here is going to work fine and dandy, and, you know, really not complicated at all. In hindsight, there's a better way to do this, probably. Well, there is a better way to do it, but this worked out fine. It just took a little bit more finagling, but anyone who has any kind of experience is probably looking at what the problem's going to be when we start framing in the top shelf. If it's not apparent now, it will be relatively shortly. I'm going to need a third cup of coffee. I'm just marking the outline of how big these 2x3s are with a scrap chunk, because it makes it a little easier, and then I know exactly where I need to drill my countersinks and my pilot holes to avoid blowing things apart. We don't have a lot of material to hold on to. If you tried to just hammer a screw in with an impact gun, this whole thing would have blown apart 100 different ways from Sunday. It just wouldn't have worked at all. I'm not absolutely hammering things in to their final place. I'm just loosely assembling while we're putting this second shelf on, in case we need to maneuver around a little bit. There's no sense in burying things. And NRS straps are a man's best friend. If you can't find a better solution, well, an NRS strap is great. They're good for tying things to the roof of vehicles, and they're good for use in the shop too, so strongly endorse. I've run that one over doing 40 miles an hour, and it makes for an interesting sound when it's attached to your roof rack, I'll tell you that much. But there was only some minor fidgety kind of stuff to get things squared up. You gotta loosen and tighten. If I'd cut all these pieces on a table saw or on a chop saw, it would have been far less tedious to get everything squared up, because I would have pretty much been guaranteed a square edge as long as everything was right with the machine and I was, paying attention when I was cutting. I don't care how good you are with a skill saw, especially a big skill saw, it's going to be difficult to get a really square edge. You can get it close, but truly square is going to be difficult. And we just continue the process going around. Get things squared up. Drill our pilot holes. Countersink. And move along. It's really straightforward. This is far less complicated than the aluminum box that I made for this radio equipment. We can get into that in the final video where we go over how things are assembled in here, the radio equipment itself. But if I were to go back, I would have just, started doing things this way right from the beginning. This was so much easier than futzing around with that metal. If I would have been back in the shop in Montana with a welder and metal chop saw and all that kind of stuff, I would have definitely been more inclined to do the metal, because it would have been far easier. But with my current shop setup, I'm just better suited for wood right now. I've got that equipment. I don't have to do things by hand. It makes it a lot easier. That's when we were futzing around with putting the second shelf on, is there is a really large span of material, and it's going to have its own weight and then a little bit more weight behind it. And it's not going to work all that well without having support behind it. So we had to add a fifth support member in the back of each shelf to make sure that the weight that gets put on it doesn't cause it to bow too much. And here we're cutting the final supports. This should be the last bit of material that we need to cut aside from plywood to make the sides and the back of this shelving unit. We're relatively straightforward at this point. It's not too horribly involved. I kept this gap smaller, and now we see where the problem is going to come with mounting the top shelf. I wanted to keep this offset like this and have the top shelf shorter than the bottom shelf. And it ended up working really well. I'm pleased with how it looks and how it's set up. And like I said, eventually we'll go into this a little bit more with how things look right now as they stand on the desk, because everything's installed and assembled and it works really well for my purposes and how I like to operate. So we will get to that eventually. And the puppers are going crazy outside. That's okay. Then we have the same consideration to make here as we did anywhere else on this box. Screws have to be countersunk, pilot hole, and driven in by hand. Just to be on the safe side, because I really didn't want to blow up any of this material. I probably could have got away with easy tappy tap taps on the impact driver, but I really didn't want to risk it. It meant that this took more time than was necessary and probably led to more blisters than were necessary, but the end result ended up being quite good, if I do say so myself. And we need to worry about the same thing here as we did in the previous shelving unit. We need to put in that fifth support on the back edge so it's not going to bow. And then here's the problem. How are we going to mount things like this? And the answer is a toenail. Or toe screw. We just need to rearrange how things are assembled and attach some of the uprights before the others. We don't really need the bottom shelf anymore. We just need to worry about the middle and the top. We need to install some areas or some supports because we won't have access to them with either a screwdriver or an impact gun once we get things as we're assembling. So this is where I needed to figure out how things were going to be assembled, in what order are we going to do things to make sure that I don't build myself into a corner where I can't reach into things and I have to take things completely apart in final assembly to put them together. And this is about where we come into final assembly before we take it back apart to paint it. Everything got painted individually. But since I've had multiple runs with screws going in and out, I'm okay using an impact gun to put things together and to take things apart, because as long as I'm careful with it, it isn't going to split anything. Those holes are already well established. And we can see how assembly needed to go. So some uprights stayed on the middle shelf, and some get put on after the fact. Since these are all overlapping, the back end had to go on after things were assembled. And this is where we end up. So it's ready to be painted after we get some side panels and a back cut.